Life has a funny way of surprising us when we least expect it. That's exactly what happened to Linda Chen, a hardworking single mom who'd spent the last decade raising her teenage daughter, Sophia, all by herself. Running her small flower shop and being both mom and dad hadn't been easy, but Linda had made it work, putting her own dreams of finding love again on the back burner. It all changed one rainy Tuesday morning when Robert Walsh walked into her shop, looking for a bouquet for his mother's birthday. There was something different about him. Maybe it was the way his eyes crinkled when he smiled, or how he spent an extra 15 minutes just chatting about different flower meanings. Linda found herself looking forward to his visits, which became more frequent over the next few months. Robert seemed perfect on paper. A successful real estate developer with his own company, he had that magnetic charm that made everyone feel special. He'd bring coffee for Linda's employees, remember their birthdays, and even help Sophia with her math homework. When he proposed 6 months later during a family dinner at Linda's favorite restaurant, it felt like a fairy tale coming true. But Sophia wasn't completely convinced. Sure, Robert was nice enough when others were around, but something felt off. It was in the little things, how his smile didn't quite reach his eyes when he looked at their family photos, or the way he quickly switched screens on his laptop whenever someone walked into the room. Most people would brush these things off as normal behavior, but Sophia had always been observant, just like her late father. At first, she tried to ignore these feelings. After all, her mom was happier than she'd been in years. Linda was finally taking time for herself, going on dates, and laughing more. The whole neighborhood loved Robert. He'd even started a community project to renovate the local park. Who was Sophia to question something that seemed so right? But then the late-night phone calls started. Sophia would wake up for a glass of water and hear Robert's hushed voice from the study, speaking in a tone she'd never heard him use before. "The papers will be ready next week," he'd whisper, or "they won't know what hit them." Each time, he'd have a perfectly reasonable explanation the next day. "Just business calls about property deals," he'd say. The engagement party was a grand affair at the city's finest hotel. Robert spared no expense, inviting what seemed like half the town. Linda looked radiant in her new dress, showing off her engagement ring to their friends and family. But during the celebrations, Sophia noticed something strange. An elderly couple stood outside the hotel, looking in through the windows with tears in their eyes. When she went to check on them, they hurried away, leaving behind a crumpled newspaper clipping about real estate fraud. That night, as Sophia lay in bed, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was standing at a crossroads. Her mom was planning the perfect winter wedding, excitedly discussing flower arrangements and cake flavors. The invitations were already being printed, yet here was Sophia, unable to silence the voice in her head that kept saying something wasn't right. She thought about her dad, who'd always told her to trust her instincts. Sometimes, he'd said, doing the right thing means being brave enough to ask the hard questions. Looking at her mom's happy face in their latest family photo, the three of them at the beach, Robert's arm around Linda's shoulders, Sophia made a decision. If something was wrong, she needed to find out, not just for her mom, but for anyone else who might be involved. Little did she know, this was just the beginning of a journey that would test her courage, challenge her beliefs about trust, and ultimately change their lives forever. Her investigation was about to uncover secrets darker than she could have imagined, leading to a wedding day that no one would ever forget. Over the next few weeks, Sophia started paying closer attention to her future stepfather's habits. It began with little things. The way Robert would place his phone face down whenever she entered the room, or how he'd always step outside to take certain calls, even in the middle of family dinner. At first, she tried to convince herself she was just being paranoid, but the strange patterns kept adding up. One evening, while helping her mom at the flower shop, Sophia overheard Robert talking to someone in the back alley. His voice was different, harder, colder, nothing like the warm tone he used with her mom. "Look, I don't care what you have to do," he'd said. "Just make sure those papers disappear before next month." When he came back inside, He was all smiles again, bringing Linda her favorite coffee and kissing her cheek. The business trips started becoming more frequent too. Robert would say he was going to Chicago for a property deal, but Sophia's friend from the debate club swore she saw him at the local diner with a group of serious-looking men in suits. When Sophia casually mentioned this to Robert, he laughed it off, saying her friend must have seen someone who looked like him. But his laugh seemed forced, and he changed the subject quickly. Things got even stranger when Sophia started helping out at Robert's office as part of her school's work experience program. His secretary, Mrs. Thompson, was a kind elderly lady who'd been there for years. One day, she pulled Sophia aside with worry in her eyes. "Dear," she whispered, "something's not right with the new contracts. The numbers don't add up, and some of our longtime clients have been calling in tears." That same afternoon, Sophia noticed Robert shredding papers in his office, stacks of them. When she asked about it, he said they were just old documents, but she caught a glimpse of one sheet before it disappeared into the shredder. It had yesterday's date on it. The turning point came during a routine evening at home. Robert had forgotten his laptop open when he went to take a shower. Sophia wasn't trying to snoop. She was just closing the tabs so she could use the computer for her homework. That's when she saw it. An email thread with the subject line, Operation Golden Years. Scanning the messages quickly, her heart started racing. There were lists of names, all elderly people with notes about their properties and assets. Her hands shaking, she took photos of the screen with her phone. Just in time, too. She heard the shower turn off upstairs. As she rushed to close everything, another email popped up. This one had pictures of familiar faces, the same elderly couple she'd seen crying outside the engagement party. That night, Sophia could barely sleep. The weight of what she'd discovered felt crushing. Her mom was humming wedding songs in the kitchen every morning, excitedly planning their perfect day. The invitations had already gone out. Linda had even started looking at houses in better neighborhoods, dreaming of their new life together. But Sophia couldn't shake off what she'd seen. She started doing some digging online, looking up the names from those emails. Each search revealed a similar pattern. Elderly homeowners who'd suddenly sold their properties for way below market value to mysterious investment companies. All the companies seemed to lead back to shell corporations, and somehow Robert's name was always just one or two steps removed. The final straw came when she overheard Robert on another late-night call. "Once the wedding's done, we'll move everything under her name. Perfect setup. Single mom, small business owner, clean record. No one will look twice." Sophia's blood ran cold. He wasn't just scamming strangers. He was planning to use her mom as a fall person. Now Sophia knew she had to act fast. The wedding was just weeks away, and her mom's future, maybe even her freedom, was at stake. But gathering proof wouldn't be easy, and she'd need to be smart about it. One wrong move, and Robert might realize she was onto him. Worse still, he might do something to hurt her mom before Sophia could expose the truth. The next few days were a blur of secret investigations and growing anxiety. Sophia knew she needed solid proof, not just hunches and overheard conversations. Her chance came unexpectedly during a Saturday afternoon when Robert asked her to help organize some files on his computer for the upcoming business presentation. Little did he know, this simple request would become his biggest mistake. While Robert was busy showing Linda potential wedding venues, Sophia sat at his home office desk, her heart pounding as she clicked through folders. At first, everything seemed normal: business proposals, property photos, and market analyses. But then she noticed something odd. A folder named Legacy Projects, hidden deep within subfolder after subfolder. The password protection on the folder might have stopped most people, but Sophia remembered the string of numbers and letters Robert always muttered under his breath when logging in. After 3 tries, she was in. And what she found made her hands shake so badly, she nearly knocked over her water bottle. Inside were hundreds of documents, each one more damning than the last. Spreadsheets detailed properties bought from elderly homeowners for a fraction of their worth. There were emails discussing how to pressure seniors into selling quickly, using tactics that made Sophia's stomach turn. Mention their grandchildren's college funds, one email advised. Remind them how burdensome property taxes are getting. But what really broke her heart were the photos. Each file had pictures of the victims, sweet-looking grandparents who'd worked their whole lives for these homes. One woman, Mrs. Wilson, had lived in her house for 50 years. According to the documents, Robert's company had convinced her to sell for just 1/3 of its value, claiming the property needed massive repairs that would bankrupt her. As she dug deeper, Sophia discovered something even more shocking. Robert wasn't working alone. He had a whole network of fake companies, each one designed to look legitimate, but actually empty shells that moved money around. The wedding wasn't just about marrying her mom. It was about creating a new front for his schemes, using Linda's clean reputation to hide his tracks. Sophia's hands trembled as she connected her phone to the computer. She had to work quickly, copying as many files as she could. Each document was another piece of evidence, another family's heartbreak. She found voice recordings too. Robert speaking to his partners, laughing about how easy it was to convince these old folks to sign away their homes. Just then, she heard a car door slam outside. Her heart nearly stopped. They were back early. Sophia rushed to close everything, trying to leave the computer exactly as she'd found it. But in her hurry, she almost missed the most important file of all, a folder labeled Post-Wedding Arrangements. With shaking fingers, she opened it, quickly scanning the contents. What she read made her blood run cold. After the wedding, Robert planned to transfer all his questionable assets to companies in her mom's name. If anything went wrong, Linda would take the fall. The documents even included a draft confession letter in her mom's name, ready to be used if needed. Footsteps on the porch. Sophia quickly copied the last file, closed everything, and cleared the browser history. By the time Robert and her mom walked in, she was innocently working on a school project, trying to keep her face neutral despite the storm of emotions inside. That night, alone in her room, Sophia went through everything she'd discovered. The scope of Robert's scheme was staggering. He'd been doing this for years, moving from city to city, leaving a trail of devastated families behind. But he'd always managed to stay just ahead of the law, using clever paperwork and fake companies to cover his tracks. Looking at her mom's happy face in their recent photos, Sophia felt tears welling up in her eyes. How could she show her mom the truth without breaking her heart? But she knew she had to. The wedding was just weeks away, and with each passing day, Robert's plan came closer to completion. Now, with solid evidence in hand, Sophia realized she was the only thing standing between her mom and disaster. She needed a plan, and she needed it fast. The weight of what Sophia had discovered kept her up at night. During breakfast, she'd watch her mom happily planning the wedding, picking out table decorations, and tasting different cakes, while Robert played the perfect future husband. The contrast between his public face and what she now knew made her feel sick to her stomach. One morning, as Sophia sat in her school's library during lunch break, her best friend Amy noticed something was wrong. "You've been staring at the same page for 20 minutes, Amy said, sliding into the chair next to her. Finally, Sophia broke down and shared everything. She pulled out her phone, showing Amy the documents she'd copied from Robert's computer. Amy's eyes grew wider with each swipe. "This is serious," she whispered. "Like really serious. Have you thought about telling your mom?" Sophia's hands trembled as she put her phone away. "Every single day," she replied. "But you should see how happy she is, Amy. This is the first time since Dad passed that she's really smiling again. How can I just destroy that?" But keeping the secret was taking its toll. Sophia's grades started slipping, and she couldn't focus in class. Her chemistry teacher, Mrs. Baker, pulled her aside after school one day. "You used to love this subject," she said gently. "What's changed?" Something about her kind eyes and genuine concern made Sophia's walls crumble. She didn't tell Mrs. Baker everything, but she asked hypothetically, "If you knew something really bad about someone, something that could hurt people, but telling the truth would also hurt someone you love. What would you do? Mrs. Baker thought for a moment before answering. Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for someone is tell them a difficult truth. Short-term happiness built on lies only leads to bigger pain later. Those words stuck with Sophia. That evening, she watched Robert and her mom dancing in the kitchen to an old love song. Her mom's eyes were closed, her head resting on Robert's shoulder, completely trusting. Robert caught Sophia watching and winked at her, but his eyes were cold. In that moment, she realized Mrs. Baker was right. The longer this went on, the worse the eventual fallout would be. Sophia started making a plan. She organized all her evidence, creating backup copies and storing them in secure places. But she knew documents alone wouldn't be enough. She needed to find the real people behind the paperwork. Using the names from Robert's files, she began searching social media, looking for his previous victims. It wasn't easy. Many of the elderly people he'd scammed weren't online much, but their grandchildren were. Sophia spent hours sending careful messages, explaining that she had information about their grandparents' property sales. Most people ignored her, probably thinking it was a scam, but a few responded. The stories they shared broke her heart all over again. Mr. Chen, a retired teacher, had lost the home he'd lived in for 40 years. Mrs. Rodriguez had been pressured to sell her family restaurant, a neighborhood landmark for 3 generations. Each story followed the same pattern. Robert's company would appear offering help with repairs or taxes, then use high-pressure tactics to force a quick sale at a fraction of the property's worth. One night, as Sophia lay in bed listening to her mom and Robert laughing downstairs, her phone lit up with a new message. It was from a woman named Grace, whose grandmother had lost her house 6 months ago. "I remember him," Grace wrote. "He even came to my grandmother's hospital room to get her signature. She was still recovering from a stroke." That was the moment Sophia knew she couldn't wait any longer. The wedding was just 2 weeks away. Robert had already started moving some assets into her mom's name. She'd seen the paperwork on his desk. The trap was closing, and her mom was walking right into it, thinking she was heading toward her happily ever after. But how do you tell someone that their dream is actually a nightmare? How do you protect someone who doesn't know they need protecting? Sophia rolled over, hugging her pillow tight, her mind racing with possibilities. Whatever she decided to do, she knew one thing for certain. She had to act soon, before it was too late. With just 2 weeks until the wedding, Sophia knew she had to move fast. She started by creating a group chat with Grace and the other victims' family she contacted. At first, everyone was hesitant to share their stories, but once they realized they weren't alone, the details came pouring out. Each message notification brought another piece of the puzzle. One evening, while helping with wedding preparations, Sophia nearly dropped the box of decorations she was carrying. Through the flower shop's window, she spotted a familiar face. Mrs. Thompson, Robert's former secretary. The elderly woman was standing across the street, looking uncertain. Sophia made an excuse about forgetting something at school and rushed outside. "I've been trying to work up the courage to come in," Mrs. Thompson admitted, her hands fidgeting with her purse strap. "I got fired last week. Robert said it was budget cuts, but..." She pulled out a thick manila envelope. "I made copies of everything before I left. I knew something wasn't right, especially after what happened to the Peters family." The Peters family story was worse than anything Sophia had uncovered so far. They'd owned a small apartment building, home to several elderly residents. Robert's company had convinced them to sell by claiming the building needed expensive repairs. Within a week of the sale, all the senior tenants received eviction notices. The building, it turned out, was perfectly fine. Robert's company had just wanted the prime real estate. Back in her room that night, Sophia spread out all her evidence. Mrs. Thompson's documents filled in crucial gaps, providing dates, signatures, and bank transfer records. She carefully photographed everything, uploading it to a secure cloud drive she created. Then she started making a timeline, connecting all the events. The pattern was crystal clear now. Robert would target small communities, usually starting with one elderly property owner. He'd gain their trust, maybe even attend their church or community events. Then he'd use that connection to reach others. By the time people realized what was happening, he'd already moved on to the next town. But this time was different. This time he'd gotten greedy, trying to pull off his biggest scheme yet, using her mom's good name and business reputation as a front. The wedding wasn't just about love. It was about creating the perfect cover story. Sophia's phone buzzed with a message from Grace. "My grandmother wants to help. She says she won't let another family go through what we did." More messages followed. Other victims and their families volunteering to speak up. They were all tired of being silent, tired of feeling ashamed for being tricked. The next day, during dinner, Robert was talking about honeymoon plans when his phone rang. Sophia watched his face carefully as he answered. His expression changed for just a second when he heard the voice on the other end. "Must be a wrong number," he said smoothly, but Sophia saw him type something quickly before putting the phone away. It was working. The pressure was getting to him. That night, she overheard him in his study, voice raised. "How did they find you?" Nobody was supposed to connect those deals. A pause. "No, listen to me carefully. If anyone calls asking questions, you don't know me. The wedding's in 2 weeks. Once everything's transferred over, we're in the clear." Sophia's heart was racing as she tiptoed back to her room. She hadn't planned to scare him yet, just to gather information. But her messages to the victims' families had created a ripple effect. People were starting to ask questions, make connections. Robert was getting nervous, and nervous people make mistakes. The next morning, she found him shredding documents in his home office again. He didn't notice her watching from the doorway, didn't see her take a quick video with her phone. Later, she played it for Mrs. Thompson, who confirmed her suspicions. Those were the same kind of documents he'd used in previous scams. Time was running out. The wedding invitations promised a beautiful winter ceremony, a celebration of love and new beginnings. But Sophia knew it would actually be something very different. A day of truth, when all of Robert's carefully constructed lies would finally come crashing down. She just hoped her mom would forgive her for what she was about to do. The morning of the wedding arrived with fresh snow covering the ground. At the Grand Hotel downtown, Linda was in the bridal suite, surrounded by friends helping her get ready. Her eyes sparkled with joy as she tried on her veil, completely unaware of what was about to unfold. Sophia stood in the corner, her heart feeling like it might burst from her chest, the weight of her laptop bag suddenly seeming impossibly heavy. "You look beautiful, Mom," Sophia managed to say, fighting back tears. She wasn't lying. Her mom truly did look radiant. That made what she had to do even harder. While the makeup artist worked on Linda's face, Sophia snuck out, saying she needed to check on the flower arrangements. In reality, she headed to the hotel lobby. One by one, they started arriving. The elderly victims of Robert's schemes, some helped by their families, others walking with canes or walkers. Mrs. Thompson came first, clutching her envelope of evidence. Then the Peters family, followed by Grace and her grandmother. They gathered quietly in a corner of the lobby, trying not to draw attention. "Are you sure about this?" Grace whispered, squeezing Sophia's hand. "It's not too late to stop." But Sophia shook her head. She'd spent the whole night thinking about it, remembering her dad's words about doing the right thing, even when it was hard. Especially when it was hard. Upstairs, she could hear the guests arriving, their voices echoing through the grand hallway. Robert was in his suite with his groomsmen, probably congratulating himself on how perfectly his plan was working out. He had no idea that his past was gathering downstairs, waiting to confront him. Sophia had set everything up carefully. The hotel's event coordinator, after hearing a simplified version of the situation, had agreed to help. The presentation screen that was supposed to show a romantic photo montage was now connected to Sophia's laptop. All the evidence was ready: documents, photos, voice recordings, even videos of Robert's victims telling their stories. As the ceremony time approached, Sophia's hands shook as she helped pin her mom's veil. "You know I love you, right?" she said suddenly, hugging Linda tight. Her mom looked surprised, but hugged back. "Of course I do, sweetie. Are you okay?" Sophia couldn't answer, just nodded and rushed out, pretending she had to fix her makeup. The wedding music started playing. Guests took their seats in the hotel's grand ballroom. Through the partly open doors, Sophia could see Robert standing at the altar, looking perfectly calm and collected in his expensive suit. He had no idea that among the guests now filling the rows were the very people whose lives he'd destroyed. Mrs. Wilson, the woman who'd lost her home while recovering from a stroke, sat in the back row, her hands clutching her daughter's arm. Mr. Chen, the retired teacher, was there too, sitting quietly with his grandchildren. They'd all come, not for revenge, but for justice, to make sure no one else would suffer what they had. The bridesmaids started their walk down the aisle. Sophia's phone buzzed, a message from Amy, who was helping coordinate with the victims. "Everyone's in place. Are you ready?" Sophia looked at herself in a nearby mirror. The junior bridesmaid dress her mom had chosen suddenly felt too tight, like it was hard to breathe. Through the doors, she could see her mom waiting in the hallway, bouquet in hand, practically glowing with happiness. For a moment, Sophia almost lost her nerve. How could she do this? How could she turn her mom's dream wedding into a nightmare? But then she remembered the draft confession letter she'd found on Robert's computer, already prepared in her mom's name. He was planning to sacrifice her mom to save himself if things went wrong. The wedding coordinator gave Sophia her signal. It was her turn to walk down the aisle. With each step, she felt the USB drive in her hidden dress pocket, containing all the evidence that would expose Robert's true nature. Her mom would start her walk in exactly 3 minutes, 3 minutes that would change everything. Sophia took a deep breath and began her walk, knowing that sometimes love means being brave enough to stop someone you care about from making a terrible mistake. Her hands had finally stopped shaking. The time for doubt was over. As the wedding march began playing and everyone stood for the bride, Sophia's fingers found the small remote control in her pocket. She watched her mom start down the aisle, looking like a princess in her white dress, and felt tears rolling down her cheeks. The genuine happiness on her mom's face made what she was about to do feel like the hardest thing she'd ever done. Just as Linda reached the halfway point down the aisle, Sophia pressed the button. The romantic background music cut off abruptly. The large screen behind the altar, which was supposed to show beautiful wedding photos, flickered to life with something very different, a document showing Robert's real estate company letterhead. "I'm sorry, Mom," Sophia said, her voice carrying in the sudden silence. "But everyone needs to know the truth." She stepped forward, moving to the center of the aisle. Robert's face had gone pale, his eyes darting between Sophia and the screen like a trapped animal. "What's going on?" Linda asked, stopping in her tracks. The confusion in her voice broke Sophia's heart, but she kept going. She had to. "This man," Sophia said, pointing at Robert, "isn't who he claims to be. He's been running a scheme targeting elderly homeowners, stealing their properties through fraud and manipulation." The screen changed, showing photographs of elderly victims, their homes, and the fraudulent documents Robert had used. From the back of the room, Mrs. Wilson slowly stood up. "He came to my hospital room," she said, her voice shaking but clear. "I was still recovering from a stroke when he made me sign away my home of 40 years. Other victims began standing up too, scattered throughout the wedding guests, each sharing their brief but devastating stories. Robert tried to laugh it off. "This is ridiculous," he said, straightening his tie. "These people are confused. They all signed legal documents." But Sophia wasn't done. The screen changed again, showing Robert's own emails, his instructions to pressure vulnerable seniors, his plans to use the wedding to hide his assets. "You were going to frame my mom," Sophia said, her voice growing stronger. "I found the confession letter you wrote in her name, ready to use if anyone caught on to your schemes." She turned to her mother, whose bouquet had fallen to the floor. Forgotten. He was going to put everything in your name, Mom. If anyone investigated, you would have taken the blame. The room erupted in whispers. Linda stood frozen in the aisle, looking between her daughter and the man she'd thought she knew. Robert's face had turned from pale to red, his perfect composure cracking. "You don't understand business," he snapped, but his voice was desperate now. "Everything I did was legal." That's when Mrs. Thompson stood up from her seat near the front. "Not according to these," she said, holding up her envelope of evidence. "I kept copies of everything, including the real property values and the fake inspection reports." More people were standing now, not just the victims, but wedding guests too. A retired judge who'd been invited spoke up. "If these documents are real, this is serious fraud." An off-duty police officer, who was a family friend, had already pulled out his phone, quietly calling his precinct. Linda finally found her voice. "Tell me this isn't true," she pleaded, looking at Robert. "Tell me my daughter is wrong." But Robert's response wasn't what anyone expected. He lunged for Sophia's laptop, trying to stop the presentation. In his rush, he knocked over the flower arrangements, sending vases crashing to the floor. "You little brat," he snarled at Sophia. "You had no right to go through my private files." His mask had completely slipped now, showing the real person beneath the charming facade. The wedding guests gasped as his true nature emerged. The phone recordings played next. Robert's own voice discussing how to pressure seniors, laughing about their desperation. With each new piece of evidence, his face grew darker. He looked around the room like a cornered animal, seeing dozens of witnesses to his exposed crimes. The grand wedding was transforming into something entirely different. But as Sophia watched her mom sink into a nearby chair, tears streaming down her face, she knew that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is tell the truth, no matter how much it hurts. The elegant wedding venue had transformed into a scene of chaos. Robert, realizing he was cornered, suddenly made a dash for the side door. Two wedding guests, Linda's cousins who worked as security guards, moved to block his path, but he was quick. He shoved past them, knocking over a decorative table in the process. "Someone stop him." Mrs. Thompson called out, clutching her envelope of evidence. The off-duty police officer who had called his precinct was already moving, speaking quickly into his phone as he followed Robert's path. Several younger guests joined the chase, including Amy's older brother, who played football in college. Meanwhile, Linda sat in shock, her beautiful white dress pulled around her like fallen snow. Sophia knelt beside her mom, taking her trembling hands. "I'm so sorry, Mom. I wanted to tell you sooner, but I needed proof. I couldn't let him hurt you like he hurt all these other people." The elderly victims gathered around them, not with anger or blame, but with understanding and support. Mrs. Wilson, leaning on her walker, reached out to touch Linda's shoulder. "You're not the first good person he's fooled, dear," she said softly. "He's very good at making people believe in him." Suddenly, a crash echoed from the hotel lobby. Robert had knocked over the gift table in his escape attempt. The sound of breaking glass and scattered presents created more commotion. Hotel security had joined the pursuit, their radios crackling with updates about Robert's location. "He's heading for the parking garage," someone shouted. Linda stood up shakily, her face tear-streaked but showing a growing determination. She kicked off her heels and headed for the lobby, Sophia right beside her. They arrived just in time to see Robert trying to unlock his car, his hand shaking so badly he kept dropping the keys. "You were going to frame me." Linda's voice carried across the garage, stronger than Sophia had ever heard it. "After everything we shared, you were planning to let me take the blame for your crimes." The pain and anger in her voice made Robert freeze for a moment. He turned, and for the first time, they all saw his true face. No charm, no fake smile, just cold calculation. "It was just business," he said, finally getting his car door open. "Nothing personal. You should be flattered. Your perfect reputation made you the ideal fall person." Those were his last words before police sirens filled the air. 2 patrol cars pulled into the garage entrance, blocking the exit. Robert slammed his car door and tried to start the engine, but he wasn't going anywhere. The off-duty officer had already radioed his location. As the police officers approached with handcuffs ready, more people arrived from the wedding, victims and their families, all carrying pieces of evidence. Grace's grandmother stepped forward, pointing a shaking finger at Robert. "That's him," she said clearly. "He's the one who threatened to have my grandchildren's college fund investigated if I didn't sell my house." The officers were professional and quick, reading Robert his rights as they led him away. His perfectly styled hair was now disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled. He looked nothing like the charming man who had proposed to Linda 6 months ago. Back in the ballroom, the wedding guests helped clean up the mess from Robert's escape attempt. The broken glass, scattered flowers, and toppled decorations seemed like a perfect metaphor for the shattered dreams of what should have been a perfect day. Linda sat at a table, still in her wedding dress, giving her statement to a detective. Her voice was steady now as she explained everything she knew about Robert's business dealings. Other victims lined up to give their statements too, each one adding another piece to the growing criminal case. Sophia watched it all, exhausted but relieved. The weight of the secret she'd been carrying was finally gone. When her mom finished with the police, she walked over and wrapped Sophia in a tight hug. "My brave, smart girl," she whispered. "You saved me from making a terrible mistake." The wedding cake sat untouched on its stand, a beautiful symbol of celebrations that would never happen. But as Sophia looked around at all the people supporting them, family, friends, and even strangers united against injustice, she realized that sometimes the most important celebrations aren't about love found, but about disaster avoided. 3 months after the wedding that never was, Linda and Sophia sat in the courthouse, holding hands as they waited to testify. The prosecution had built a strong case against Robert, thanks to the mountain of evidence Sophia had gathered and the brave testimonies of his victims. The courtroom was packed. Many familiar faces from the wedding day were there. Mrs. Thompson with her detailed records, the elderly victims and their families, even the hotel staff who had helped stop Robert's escape. They weren't just witnesses anymore. They had become a kind of family, united by their shared experience. "The court calls Linda Chen to the stand," the bailiff announced. Linda squeezed Sophia's hand one last time before walking forward. She looked different now, stronger, more confident. The heartbreak had changed her, but not in the way Robert might have hoped. Instead of breaking her, it had revealed her true strength. "Can you tell us how you met the defendant?" the prosecutor asked. Linda's voice was clear and steady as she described their whirlwind romance, now seeing all the red flags she'd missed before. She explained how Robert had slowly begun asking about her business, suggesting ways to protect their future by putting properties in her name. When it was Sophia's turn to testify, she walked to the stand with her head held high. She described finding the evidence, her internal struggle, and the difficult decision to expose the truth at the wedding. The prosecutor displayed her carefully organized files, the emails, the fake documents, and the draft confession letter Robert had prepared in Linda's name. "How did you know where to look?" the prosecutor asked. Sophia glanced at her mom before answering. "My dad always told me to trust my instincts when something feels wrong. He said being brave isn't about not being scared. It's about doing the right thing even when you're terrified." The trial lasted 2 weeks. Robert's lawyer tried to paint everything as simple business misunderstandings, but the evidence was overwhelming. When the jury returned with their verdict, no one was surprised. Guilty on all counts. The judge's sentence was harsh: 15 years in prison and full restitution to all victims. But the real healing began after the trial. Linda used her business skills to help some of the victims negotiate with their banks, trying to recover their properties. She and Mrs. Wilson became especially close, working together to create a support group for seniors facing property fraud. Sophia's evidence had exposed similar schemes in other cities, leading to more investigations and arrests. She was invited to speak at community centers and senior homes, teaching elderly residents how to protect themselves from scammers. Her simple presentation, "Trust your gut, spotting real estate fraud," became surprisingly popular. One evening, as they were closing up the flower shop, Linda found Sophia looking at an old photo of her dad. "He would be so proud of you," Linda said, hugging her daughter. "I know I am." Sophia smiled, remembering how scared she'd been that her mom would never forgive her for ruining the wedding. "You know what's funny?" Linda said, arranging the last bouquet of the day. "For months, I thought Robert was going to give me my happy ending. But real happiness isn't about finding the perfect person. It's about being surrounded by people who love you enough to tell you the truth, even when it hurts." The story of the wedding that turned into an arrest made the local news, then went viral online. People called Sophia a hero, but she didn't feel like one. She was just a daughter who loved her mom enough to risk everything to protect her. A year later, they held a different kind of celebration. The opening of the Chen Family Foundation, dedicated to helping elderly victims of financial fraud. The same hotel that should have hosted the wedding now hosted this event. Many familiar faces were there, but this time there were only genuine smiles. As Sophia watched her mom cut the ribbon, surrounded by the people whose lives they'd helped rebuild, she realized something important. Sometimes the best endings aren't the ones we planned for, but the ones that find us when we're brave enough to stand up for what's right. Mrs. Wilson summed it up best in her speech that day. "Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't saying I do. It's having the courage to say, I can't let this happen." One brave girl's decision not only saved her mother, but gave hope to so many others. That's a love story worth telling.